SRA 211, Session 2.3.1, The Terrorist Threat Today. In this presentation, we will take a look at a few of the concepts of threat, vulnerability, and risk in the context of counterterrorism. We'll also spend a moment discussing risk perceptions and distortions of risk. Then we'll talk a little bit about the terrorist threat today. We'll say a few words about the frequency of terrorist attacks, some developments in trends of types of attack, and then a word or two about threat assessments. Note that there will be an accompanying reading or readings for this presentation that will provide some statistics both on the frequency of terrorist attacks today and also on the most recent threat assessment of the United States government. In assessing risks, including the risks of terrorism, counterterrorism and other officials often refer to something called the risk equation, which is basically the premise that risk equals threat times vulnerability times consequence. Let's take these individually. A threat is considered to be any person, circumstance, or event with the potential to cause loss or damage. Vulnerability is any weakness that can be exploited by an adversary or through some accidental occurrence. And consequence is the amount of loss or damage that can be expected from a successful attack by the threat and vulnerability. Now, threat and vulnerability taken together are sometimes expressed as probability. And maybe that's an easier way to look at this equation. In that sense, risk would be equal to probability times consequence. In other words, the risk of something is taken as a factor of how likely it is to happen, the probability, and how bad it's going to be if it does happen, the consequence. Multiplying these two things or factoring them together gives what is called the risk of any given occurrence. Now, risk perceptions may not be aligned with actual risk. Human nature being what it is, a person's or an individual's perception of risk, or the sense of fear, often does not correspond to actual risk levels. Researchers talk about a distortion caused by rare but extreme threats. This would mean that there's a subjective assessment of risk that is often at odds with the actual objective risk. It may be over or underestimated. It's usually overestimated, sometimes borders on the irrational. For example, in most years in the United States, unless it's a very bad year for airline safety, more people are killed and injured falling off ladders than in aircraft accidents. Yet very few people are really afraid of ladders. A lot of people are afraid of flying. So this is the subjective perception. When it does happen, it's really bad, it makes spectacular headlines, and people focus on it. But as I said, in most years, more people are killed in sort of homeowner type accidents than on aircraft. That type of distortion of perceptions sometimes carries over to terrorist threats. The risk of certain types of terrorist threats may be exaggerated as well. For years, counterterrorism officials focused, for example, on airport security, possibly because of all the attention and headlines and so on. Whereas it was only recently that people started to focus on the need for increased seaport security, which in terms of the actual objective risk was probably greater. So please keep in mind as we go through the course that risk perceptions may be at variance with what the actual objective risk is. Having considered risk and risk perceptions, let's now turn to the current terrorist threat. In the United States, U.S. law requires the Department of State to maintain complete statistical information on the number of individuals, including U.S. citizens and dual nationals, who are killed, injured, or kidnapped as a result of terrorism during each calendar year. You can see we've talked about definitions before. There is a definition used that provides that terrorism is the premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. These are compiled for the U.S. Department of State by something called the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, with the acronym START. It's a Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Center of Excellence based at the University of Maryland. Please take a look at the reading assignment for this presentation that will provide the most recent statistics that were compiled on terrorism for the latest year. In addition to compiling yearly statistics on worldwide terrorism, one of the things that this consortium, START, has done is to take a closer look at terrorist attacks that occurred in the United States between the years 1970 and 2012. Now, of course, this is not up to date, but it gives a 42-year sort of look at terrorist trends in the United States, and as such is instructive. What the study found is that in those years, from 1970 through 2012, there were more than 2,600 terrorist attacks in the United States. These resulted in more than 3,500 fatalities. Of course, a great percentage, approximately 86% of all the deaths that occurred on one day, September 11th, 2001. Interestingly, nearly 80% of all of the terrorist attacks involve no casualties of any kind, fatalities or injuries. And more than half of the terrorist attacks took place in the 1970s. Between 2000 and 2012, there were fewer than 20 attacks per year on average. This study took a look at targets of those attacks during that 42-year period and found that the most frequently attacked type of target in the United States was business targets. And nearly 1/3 of all the attacks on such business targets were on banks or commercial entities. An additional 22% were on retail entities. The remaining attacks targeted a variety of different types of businesses. And these terrorist attacks frequently targeted buildings and infrastructure rather than individuals. This probably accounts for the fact that in most of the terrorist attacks, there were no casualties. The study also took a close look at the perpetrators of these 42 years of attacks in cases where perpetrators could be identified. Let's take a look at the information just for the 12-year period from 2000 to 2012. In that period, the majority of the attacks in which the perpetrators were actually identified were carried out by environmental and animal rights violent extremist groups. In some cases, attacks were carried out by individuals not known to be affiliated with a perpetrator group of any kind. In fact, 7 of the 13 attacks that occurred in 2012 were attributed to unaffiliated individual perpetrators. This slide basically just refers to the foregoing information more in a graphical format. You can see that the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front carried out by far the lion's share of attacks during this 12-year period. There were some Islamic extremist groups, anti-abortion violent extremists, and so on, Ku Klux Klan, Minutemen, American Defense militias, but by and large, these sort of radical environmental or animal rights groups. Finally, the study took a look at the types of weapons used in the attacks over the entire 42-year period. And as you can see, explosives, bombs, and dynamite were used in over half of the attacks. Various types of incendiary devices, firebombs, were used in almost 30%, firearms only in 13%, and various other small percentages. So the overwhelming type of weapon used in these attacks, again, consistent with the type of property damage that was caused by many of them, as opposed to human casualties, were in fact explosives, bombs, and dynamite. It is important to say a word or two here about trends in the nature of terrorist attacks. In fact, the nature of terrorist violence has evolved and changed over time. Up until the 1980s, and including many of those 1970s attacks in the United States where no one was injured or killed, casualties from terrorist attacks were relatively limited. Yes, there were hijackings, there were shootings, but by and large it was a few people at a time. Indeed, the focus throughout much of the 1970s internationally, as opposed to in the United States, was on aircraft and other hijackings and hostage-taking. It wasn't until sort of the late 1980s or even into the 1990s that the nature of terrorist attacks was marked by a fundamental change. This is important. This is what was called the onset of the mass casualty attack. Mass casualty attack, with the best example being the 9/11 attacks in the United States, although there have been other attacks now that have resulted in hundreds of casualties. Together with this onset of the mass casualty attack, we're seeing more of a blurring of political and ideological goals. What's meant by that? In the 1970s, terrorists often wanted to make a statement, hijack an aircraft, take some people hostage, and make their demands and goals known. Now there's more of a focus on actually killing or punishing the perceived enemy, being the innocent civilians usually who are the targets of terrorist attacks. There's less of an aim to obtain any political concessions or demands on the part of the terrorists. There often are no demands. There are just terrorist attacks that are meant to kill as many people as possible. This has been the fundamental change in the nature of terrorism from the 1970s and early 80s to the 1990s and continuing on to today. Another important trend, or perhaps two trends, with respect to today's terrorism and the threat of terrorism today are the internationalization of terrorism and the use by terrorists of information technology. What do we mean by this? We're starting to see, although there has been precedent for this, terrorist organizations made up of individuals from more than one country. Also cooperation to a certain extent between and among terrorist groups. We have seen this in the past as well with European extremists and Palestinian groups, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Japanese Red Army, the IRA and the Basque ETA, but now we're seeing more international cooperation. It's worth mentioning that the United States military distinguishes actually between two concepts: international and transnational terrorist groups. Now, the distinction is somewhat subtle and may be artificial, but here they are. International terrorist organizations are those that operate in multiple countries but keep a primary geographic focus. What does that mean? That means that the issue or issues that the terrorist group is interested in, to the extent they can be determined, is made up of one complex of issues in basically one place. A good example of that would be Hezbollah, a terrorist organization with worldwide operations, but a real focus on Lebanon and Israel and the Palestinian territories in their sort of operation. Transnational would be terrorist organizations that operate internationally and not tied to any country or region. Al-Qaeda is probably still the best example of these, with worldwide operations and very broad goals, although as we'll see, Al-Qaeda has been degraded significantly. The Islamic State, ISIS, can be considered also a transnational group, although of course their focus is on creating, or they tried to create their caliphate or country in the territories of Iraq and Syria. In any case, note that the United States military does distinguish between these two types, basically with a similar focus. Not surprisingly, the trend toward internationalization in today's digital age has been accompanied by a revolution also on the part of terrorists and terrorist use of information technology. The growth of information technologies has led to greater terrorist operational capabilities by facilitating the terrorist's ability to do a number of things, to communicate globally, to disseminate or spread their political message. We'll take a look at cyber jihad later in the semester. Information technology allows terrorist organizations to collect intelligence, to recruit new members. Recall that while recruitment had normally been done by traditional family, clan ties, there is this new emerging phenomenon of remote or internet recruitment. Access to information technology has allowed terrorist organizations to acquire knowledge about more lethal weapons, manage finances, and certainly, especially when we look at cyber terrorism a bit later, attack more distant targets. Now, information technology has also enhanced the capabilities of counterterrorism officials, and we will look at that a little bit later in the semester. But note the importance of information technology on both sides. Let us consider for a moment the concepts of domestic versus international terrorism. Of course, you can say that distinctions are sometimes blurred, but the FBI still does distinguish between domestic and international terrorism, depending on the origin, base, and objectives of the terrorist groups. Domestic terrorism is defined as being terrorism committed by individuals or groups operating entirely within the United States without foreign direction for the purpose of the United States. So basically, people operating in the United States against United States targets. International terrorism is defined as terrorist acts that occur outside the United States or transcend national boundaries. The most important distinction is that domestic terrorism falls largely within the domain of crime, and counterterrorism efforts for domestic terrorism mostly involve, in the first instance, law enforcement measures. While other means are, of course, applicable, law enforcement is the key. International terrorism, on the other hand, includes both criminal pursuit and foreign policy elements, may result in law enforcement, diplomatic, or even military responses, as we'll see later in Unit 3. Domestic or homegrown terrorists operate within and against their home country. These have been most often linked to extreme social or political causes, although lately, as we'll see, the rise of homegrown Islamic terrorism has been a phenomenon in the United States. But the focus here is on terrorism exclusively in one's own nation. The individuals depicted on this slide, Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, and the so-called Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, would be examples of homegrown terrorists. Now, they may be easier to spot and possibly, if they're operating in groups, to infiltrate because they're operating in the United States. But at the same time, it's harder to monitor and prosecute due to various legal constraints if the terrorists are in fact U.S. citizens. We'll have a look at legal aspects of counterterrorism in Unit 3. While we will take a look at Islamic extremism as a basis for terrorism a bit later in the semester, it's worth mentioning here that incidents in the United States of homegrown Islamic extremist terrorism have, it seems, been on the rise. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers the Boston Marathon bombing of April 15th, 2013, the Tsarnaev brothers. The San Bernardino attacks in 2015, in which 14 people were killed and 22 seriously wounded, were the work of Syed Rizwan Farooq and his wife Tashfeen Malik. He was a U.S. citizen born in the United States, so it would be considered homegrown terrorism, even though their stated motivation was Islamic extremism. The Orlando nightclub attack of 2016, in which Omar Mateen killed 49 people and wounded 53 others, was likewise attributed to motivations, at least in part, of Islamic extremism. Can be considered a homegrown terrorist attack. Let us now return a bit to the science and consider the assessment methods for terrorist threats. First of all, it's important to note that terrorist threat assessments usually rely on a number of initial assumptions. Terrorists are rational, strategic actors. Recall our discussion from Unit 1. And that terrorists will consider perceived weaknesses in the victim's defenses in selecting targets. They will look for a path of least resistance. Threat assessments seek to evaluate individual threats by specific terrorist groups based on a variety of factors. The intention, motivations of the terrorists to the extent that they're known, the probability of the attack, the capability of the terrorist group, and the lethality or damage to be caused by the expected attacks. As you can see, that harkens back to our equation that we discussed earlier in this presentation. Some of the tools that are used by counterterrorism professionals in trying to make assessments about a specific or even a generalized terrorist threat are the collection and analysis of intelligence and other data, mapping and analyzing known or suspected terrorist networks, coordination among interagency within the United States and international partners, including in particular data sharing. And then some officials use gaming exercises that focus on terrorist capabilities and intentions. Note that some of these tools rely on concepts and procedures that we considered in Unit 1. Using all of these tools, the United States intelligence community every year compiles a worldwide threat assessment. This is done under the direction of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and is provided to Congress. This assessment, of course, outlines a number of major threats to U.S. national security. Terrorism is only one of the threats. In addition to the written report, the Director of National Intelligence provides an oral briefing to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence on the key points of that report. And of course, the report includes a section on the threat of terrorism. So in conclusion, please refer to the reading assignment for this presentation that will provide some information on the most recent assessment of the United States intelligence community.